Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing stories. Today, we'll explore the dark corners of the Appalachian Mountains, where two brothers learned that some secrets should never be found. This video is not real. It was made just for fun. It is purely a coincidence that any of the characters in this story are like real people, living or dead. The Greene brothers owned a private property in the West Virginia highlands, where thick, old forests grow. People in the area knew Thomas and William Greene as quiet men who didn't like to talk to people from nearby villages. People said that the house on the hill, surrounded by oak trees that had been there for hundreds of years, had a different feel to it. The air seemed heavier when someone came near. The brothers decided to make the property bigger in 1911 and started digging the land to build a new barn. William found something buried under layers of dirt and stones while he was digging. It was a dark, wooden box with strange symbols on it that none of them could read. The wood was surprisingly well preserved, as if it had been buried for a long time, even though the depth suggested that it had been left alone for decades or even centuries. Thomas wanted to leave the box where it was, but William, who was curious but didn't know why, insisted on opening it. They found things inside that looked like they were part of a ritual. There were black candles that had melted, pieces of fabric that had been stained with dark substances, and a diary written in a language that mixed old-fashioned English with words that sounded like they came from an old European dialect. The yellowed pages talked about calling on portals between worlds and beings that lived in the shadows and answered certain calls. The diary said that those things had been sealed up so that nothing else could happen in that land. William was so interested in what was in the diary that he spent nights reading it by lamplight. Thomas begged his brother to burn everything and forget about what they had found, but William said that it was important information that could help them learn more about the nature of reality. He started copying parts of the diary to figure out the patterns of the symbols and the instructions that seemed to be for complicated ceremonies. Things started to change on the property at that point. First, there were the noises. Even though both brothers were in their rooms, footsteps echoed through the house's hallways at night. In the morning, doors that had been locked would be open. Things would move for no reason. Thomas would wake up with the feeling that someone had been watching him sleep next to his bed. William, on the other hand, began to have vivid dreams of hooded people holding ceremonies in clearings in the woods. When he woke up, he was sure that those dreams were memories of things that had happened. The Greene property started to have strange lights coming from it in the early morning hours, according to the closest neighbors who lived a few kilometers away. They said they saw lights flashing in the windows, like someone was turning on and off a bunch of flashlights at once. Some people said they heard chants in a language they didn't know, and voices that seemed to come from all over at once. But when someone came up to them during the day to check, the siblings said there was nothing strange going on and asked to be left alone. William was sure that something had come to life when he opened the box. He thought that the people who wrote the diary had been imprisoned in some way, and that taking away the ritual objects had broken the seal that kept them there. Thomas was getting more and more scared and wanted to put everything back in the hole and cover it up again. William, on the other hand, said it was too late. He said that what had been started needed to be finished, or the signs would only get worse. And that's what happened. The people in the house became more real and bold. Things not only moved around, but they were also thrown out of the windows. The walls started to look like they had the same symbols on them as the ones in the box. The temperature in some rooms of the house dropped a lot, even during the hot summer days in the Appalachian Mountains. Then the visions started. Both brothers started to see shapes in the dark corners of the house. They looked like people, but their bodies were twisted, as if they didn't have normal proportions. These figures seemed to always be watching them, always in the corners of their vision, and they would disappear when they were looked at directly. William wrote down each appearance in his own diary, looking for patterns, times, and conditions that made the appearances more likely. He was obsessed with figuring out what was going on, but Thomas just wanted it to stop. Thomas could no longer recognize William's obsession with the problems that were affecting the property. His brother spent hours locked in his office, surrounded by pages from the old diary and his own notes, trying to figure out what every symbol and strange phrase meant. He had stopped sleeping properly, and his appearance reflected this neglect. Sunken eyes, unshaven beard, and hands trembling slightly whenever he picked up his pen to write. Thomas tried to keep things as normal as possible by taking care of the animals and the small vegetable garden they grew, but even these simple tasks became hard. The horses refused to enter the stable after nightfall, neighing nervously and pulling on the reins in the opposite direction. The hens stopped laying eggs. The cows stayed as far away from the main house as they could, as if some kind of instinct told them there was danger nearby. One night, Thomas was awakened by a sound coming from downstairs. It wasn't the usual footsteps that had become a constant presence. It was something different, a heavy dragging, as if someone were moving furniture from one side to the other. He turned on the light and went downstairs, his heart racing. The living room was completely rearranged. The table in the middle had been moved up against the wall. The chairs were arranged in a circle, and in the middle of that circle, drawn with something that looked like ashes, was one of the symbols from the cursed box. William appeared in the office doorway, clutching the old diary to his chest. His eyes held a disturbing intensity, and he spoke with a conviction that frightened Thomas. He said he had finally understood the purpose of those objects. They weren't tools for imprisoning entities, as he had initially thought. They were instruments of communication. The rituals described in the diary weren't for banishing, but for establishing contact, for opening passages between different planes of existence. Thomas pleaded with his brother to abandon that line of thinking. He argued that they were simple farmers, men without formal education in spiritual or philosophical matters, and meddling with forces they didn't understand could only bring terrible consequences. But William was convinced that there was something waiting to communicate through those rituals, something that possessed knowledge beyond ordinary human comprehension. In the following weeks, William began to hold ceremonies alone, always during the darkest hours of the night. Thomas could hear the chants coming from the basement, words in languages that sounded ancient and foreign. Sometimes, other voices seemed to answer echoes that came from no specific direction, but from everywhere at once. The whole house vibrated with these sessions, the walls groaning as if the building itself were under pressure. The manifestations intensified in ways that defied any rational explanation. Objects levitated briefly before falling. Shadows on the walls moved independently of any light source. The air grew thick, almost tangible, as if the atmosphere itself were transforming into something solid. Thomas began to seriously consider abandoning the property, leaving his brother behind if necessary, but something kept him tied to it. Perhaps it was family loyalty, or perhaps the very forces William had invoked wouldn't allow anyone to simply leave. In 1912, a merchant who occasionally sold supplies to the Greene brothers decided to pay an unannounced visit. He had noticed they hadn't been to the village for months and was worried. When he arrived at the property, he found the main gate open and swaying in the wind. The house seemed abandoned at first glance, but he could see smoke rising from the chimney. He called out to the brothers, but no one answered. He hesitated, feeling something profoundly wrong in that place, a visceral sensation that he shouldn't be there. Finally, gathering his courage, the merchant entered the house. The room was in disarray, with papers scattered everywhere, covered in frantic drawings and writing. Furniture was overturned, dirty dishes piled up, but what truly disturbed him were the marks on the walls. Symbols had been scratched or painted on virtually every surface, some so intricate that they hurt the eyes to look at for long. It was as if the very structure of the house had been transformed into a kind of giant manuscript. He called out again for the Greenes, his voice echoing through the empty corridors. Then he heard a noise coming from the cellar. He descended the wooden stairs that creaked beneath his feet, the lamp he carried casting dancing shadows on the damp walls. In the cellar, he found Thomas huddled in a corner, murmuring incoherently. The man looked weak, like he hadn't eaten in a long time. His eyes had a distant expression, as if he was staring at something the merchant couldn't see. When questioned about William, Thomas merely pointed to a door leading to an even deeper section of the cellar, an area the merchant didn't know existed. The door was slightly open, and a weak green light that didn't seem to come from anywhere else pulsed from the other side. The merchant's body was telling him not to go through that door, but he did it anyway because he was worried about William. The merchant slowly pushed the door open, and what he saw on the other side made no sense at all. The room below ground was much bigger than it should have been, given the size of the house above. The walls were covered in the same scary symbols, but here they looked like they were glowing with their own greenish light, as if they had been painted with something that glows in the dark. There was a circle drawn on the ground and floor in the middle of the room. Inside the circle were candles arranged in complicated geometric shapes. William stood in the middle of the circle with his back to the door and didn't move at all. He held the old diary open in front of him, and his voice echoed softly as he read words in a language that made no sense. The merchant called his name, but William didn't respond, as if he were in a deep trance. The air in the room was thick and heavy, and it was full of energy that made the hairs on a visitor's neck stand on end. Something was very wrong in that space, something that went beyond just being physically uncomfortable. As the merchant stepped forward, attempting to approach William, he felt a resistance in the air, as if trying to cross dense water. Every movement required effort, and the candlelight began to flicker violently, though there was no perceptible draft. William finally turned, and the merchant instinctively recoiled. The man's eyes were different, not physically altered, but there was something in the way they looked, a disturbing depth, that suggested the one staring back was not exactly William Greene. The merchant ran out of the room, tripped on the stairs, pulled Thomas out of the house, and the two of them ran away as fast as they could. Thomas was too weak to fight back, so he kept mumbling about portals that shouldn't be opened, beings that came from places that were hard to understand, and the price that would be paid for being too curious, all the way to the nearest village. In the days that followed, Thomas's neighbors took care of him and tried to help him get better physically and mentally. He didn't eat much, slept even less, and whenever they asked him about what had happened on the property, he would panic. During times when he was more clear-headed, only bits and pieces of information could be gotten from him. He talked about how William had come to believe that he was about to make a big discovery and that he was about to connect with beings from another plane of existence. Thomas said that his brother thought those beings knew things about the true nature of reality and secrets that people had either forgotten or never known. William was obsessed with the idea of going beyond the limits of normal life and touching something bigger than what normal people could experience. Thomas, on the other hand, was sure that William had lost something important about himself by doing this, as if each ritual took away a piece of his humanity. Some people in the village said that someone should go back to the Greene property to see what had happened to William. But every time this topic came up, everyone in the group felt uneasy. There was something about Thomas's story, the way the merchant talked about the mood in that house, that made me not want to look into it anymore. It was like everyone knew without thinking that some doors should not be crossed once they were opened. Weeks went by, and lights could still be seen on the Greene property at night. The merchant had said that there was a greenish glow that could sometimes be seen from the hills nearby. It pulsed at random times, People who lived closer also heard sounds like chants in strange languages that echoed through the thick Appalachian forests. But no one was brave enough to get close enough to find out where these things came from. Thomas, who was slowly getting stronger, became more and more adamant that property should be avoided at all costs. He talked about how William had changed into something else, something that used his brother's body and voice but thought and saw the world in a way that was completely different. He said that those rituals were more than just ways to talk to each other. They were ways to change what it meant to be human. Thomas would tell anyone who would listen about the beings his brother had talked to that weren't necessarily evil in the usual way. They just lived by different rules and followed principles that the human mind wasn't meant to understand. And when someone tried to force that understanding, when someone purposely opened their mind to these other realities, the effects on the human mind were always terrible. The house on the hilltop stayed up, and during the day, its windows were dark. At night, though, they were sometimes lit up by that strange light. The plants around it started to grow in strange ways, branches growing on trees at strange angles. Plants that don't usually grow in that area coming up from the ground around the house. It was like something coming from that place was affecting nature itself, a small amount of pollution that slowly changed the environment. Thomas eventually left the region, unable to bear the proximity to the property that had been his home. He left without looking back, taking only a small suitcase with his most important things. Before he left, he told the people who lived there over and over again that no one should go near that house, and that William's work could not be stopped by normal means. His last words before boarding the carriage that would take him away were about how some knowledge was too dangerous to seek. The Greene property quickly gained a sinister reputation among the nearby communities. People who drove along the road that went through the mountains said they felt strange things as they got closer to the area. Some people said they felt pressure in their chest and had trouble breathing, as if the air there were thicker. Some people said they felt an inexplicable urge to go off the path and take different routes, even if it meant spending more time on the road. It was like something on the property was sending out a silent message telling everyone to stay away. In the summer of 1913, a traveling pastor came to the village closest to the Greene property. He had heard stories about the empty house and the strange things that had happened to it since it was left alone. He was a deeply religious man and thought it was his duty to face any evil that might be there. Even though the locals told him not to, he was set on going to the property and doing some kind of purification ceremony. The shepherd walked along the path that led to the house on the hilltop. He had his Bible and a silver cross that had belonged to his grandfather. He noticed that the forest got quieter as he climbed. There were no birds singing, no buzzing insects, and no small animals moving around in the plants. It was a scary, soundless space, like all living things had learned to stay away from that area. The trees around him looked bent, and their bark had patterns that were similar to the symbols the merchant had talked about. The pastor stopped in front of the gate when he finally got to the property. The house looked like it was falling apart, with broken windows and loose boards, but it still felt like it was inhabited. Not in the sense that someone lived there, but as if the building itself had a presence, a consciousness that watched and waited. He took a deep breath, said a prayer, and walked through the gate. The inside of the house was in very bad shape. The furniture was dusty, there were cobwebs in the corners, and the wallpaper was peeling off the wet walls, but the symbols were still there, somehow protected from the elements. They looked almost neat, like they had just been drawn. The pastor started reading Bible verses out loud, and the sound of his voice echoed through the empty rooms. At that point, he felt something that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there but was only now becoming clear. It wasn't something that could be seen or touched, but it was real. It felt like many eyes were on me at once, with focused attention coming from all over the place. The pastor held the crucifix tighter and prayed harder, But the presence didn't go away. If anything, it seemed to get closer. He was curious about the disturbance and tried to move toward the basement door, where he thought the source of the problem was. But with every step, the resistance grew. It wasn't a physical barrier, but a psychological one that made every move feel like a huge effort of will. His vision started to blur at the edges, and strange shapes would appear and disappear in his field of vision. There were sounds all around him that he couldn't figure out where they were coming from, and voices whispered in languages he didn't know. The pastor finally pulled back when he realized he was dealing with something he couldn't understand or do anything about. He left the house quickly, his heart racing, and didn't stop walking until he was far away from the property. He looked shaken when he got back to the village. He called the villagers together and told them that this place was beyond any ritual of purification he knew of. He said that the thing that lived in that house wasn't just evil. It was something else entirely, something that didn't fit into the usual ideas of good and evil. People in other parts of the Appalachian Mountains started to hear about the Greene property. Each new story added its own details, and over time it became hard to tell the original facts from the ones that were added later. Some people said that William Greene still lived in the house, but he was no longer a normal person. Some people said that he had completely vanished, leaving only the beings he had called to live there permanently. The warning was the same in all versions. Stay away from the property, not because of fear of immediate physical danger, but because of something more insidious. People who spent too much time near the house started to have scary dreams. In these dreams, they walked through hallways that didn't exist in the building's physical structure, found doors that led to places that weren't possible, and heard voices offering knowledge in exchange for something that was never made clear. Finally, in 1914, the local government decided that something had to be done. The property was always on people's minds, and reports of strange things happening there kept coming in. A small group of men who didn't believe in superstitions and were determined to solve the mystery once and for all set out on an expedition. They were going to go into the house, look for signs of occupancy, and, if necessary, tear it down to put an end to the stories that scared people in the area. The expedition left on a gray autumn morning, when the fog still covered the mountains like a thick blanket. There were 5 men in total, each with a lantern and tools, who were determined to clear up the rumors that had grown up around the Greene property. There was a carpenter, a blacksmith, 2 farmers from the area, and a man who had been sheriff in a nearby village for a short time. All of them were very skeptical of the supernatural stories that were going around in the area. The fog seemed thicker on the property than it did anywhere else on the trail when they got there. It wrapped around the house like a living thing, hiding details and making shapes that disappeared when you looked at them directly. The group stopped for a moment in front of the gate, but their pride and determination pushed them on. They had a reason for coming and wouldn't leave until they had done it. The carpenter was the first person to go inside. He pushed open the front door, which creaked loudly because the hinges were rusty. The sound echoed in a strange way, lasting longer than it should have. The inside was just like the merchant and the pastor had said. There were symbols on the walls, the furniture was all over the place, and the air was so heavy that it felt like every breath was a conscious effort. But for practical people who were used to doing hard work and dealing with real problems, it was just an old house that needed cleaning and repairs. They went their separate ways to look around the different rooms. The blacksmith and one of the farmers went up to the 2nd floor, but the others stayed on the ground floor and looked at the symbols on the walls with clinical interest. The old sheriff said that it looked like the work of someone with mental problems, not proof of supernatural events. The carpenter agreed, saying that the house's damage was easy to understand because it had been left alone for so long and had been exposed to the weather. But then things didn't go as planned. The farmer, who was looking at the fireplace, saw that there were new ashes there, as if someone had just set a fire. This was odd because everyone thought the house had been empty for years. The old sheriff found plates in the kitchen that were dusty but still had food on them that didn't seem to have broken down as much as he thought it would. It felt like time worked differently in that place. The blacksmith and his friend found a room upstairs that was locked from the inside. This didn't make any sense. If the house was really empty, how could a room be locked from the inside? They broke the door down, and when it finally opened, they found a room that was in perfect condition. The bed was made, the clothes were neatly hung up in the closet, and a lamp was on the nightstand. It seemed like someone still lived there and had just stepped out for a bit. The two men quickly went downstairs to tell the others what had happened. While they were talking about what they had found, they all heard a noise coming from the basement. It wasn't quite footsteps, but something being dragged along slowly and carefully. Everyone in the group stopped talking and looked at each other, waiting for someone to admit to making the noise. But they were all in the living room together. The thing that made that noise came from somewhere else. The former sheriff, trying to keep the group calm, said that it could be an animal that had gotten into the basement looking for a place to stay. He said, "Rats were common in old houses." In that quiet place, even small sounds seemed louder. The others agreed and held on to this logical explanation, but the tension grew, and no amount of logic could completely get rid of it. They all agreed to look in the basement together because no one wanted to be alone after what they had found. As they went down the wooden stairs, each step creaked under their combined weight. Even with the flashlights, the basement was dark. The shadows looked thicker than they should have, and the door to the deepest room, the one the merchant had talked about, was still open, with a faint greenish light pulsing from the other side. They all didn't want to be the first to go through that door. Their faith that had gotten them this far was starting to fade. The way that light pulsed at random times brought out a deep-seated fear that made no sense. Finally, the carpenter stepped forward, opened the door all the way, and went inside. He suddenly stopped, and the others rushed up behind him to see what had caught his eye. The room looked just like it did in the pictures, but now there was something else. There was a figure in the middle of the circle that was drawn on the floor. It wasn't solid all the way through. It felt more like a distortion in the air, something that could be felt but not clearly seen. And it was moving slowly, as if it were getting clearer and more real. The group pulled back without thinking. There was no talk or argument about what to do. At the most basic level of their minds, each man knew that this was not something they should deal with. They ran up the stairs, tripping over each other, through the house in a panic, and didn't stop until they were far away from the property. When they finally caught their breath and looked at each other on the way back, they all agreed without saying anything. None of them would go into detail about what they had seen. No one would try to make sense of it or explain it. They just told the villagers that the property should stay the same when they got back. They didn't give long explanations or try to convince anyone of anything in particular. They only made it clear that tearing down the house wasn't an option, and that the best thing to do was to stay away from it. The way they talked about the issue with authority, and didn't look each other in the eye, said more than any long description could. After that, the Greene property was a place where everyone was quiet. People didn't talk about it openly, but everyone knew where it was, and that they should stay away from it. Parents would almost instinctively tell their older kids about paths to stay away from. Travelers were subtly told to take different paths that kept them away from that hill. The house stayed up, and from some places in the mountains you could see it. Its dark shape against the sky always looked a little out of place, like it didn't quite fit in with the rest of the landscape. The plants around the property kept growing in strange ways over the years. The vines on the house's walls grew in patterns that looked like they were planned, almost like they were geometric. The trees nearby grew branches that bent in odd ways, making natural arches that framed the view of the house from certain angles. Some of the plants that grew well there were not native to the Appalachian region, and no one could figure out how they got there or why they only thrived in that one area. A strong blizzard hit the mountains in the winter of 1916, covering the whole area in a thick layer of white snow. The cold made everything quiet and still, and people stayed inside, keeping their fires going and waiting for the storm to pass. But even on those cold days, people who lived on Greene Hill said something strange happened. The snow didn't build up all the way around the property. There was a border where the snow melted faster, as if the ground there gave off its own heat. This heat came from the ground and kept the area at a different temperature than the rest of the region. A young hunter went into the most remote forests in search of deer when spring finally came and the thaw began. He had recently moved to the area and wasn't from there originally, so he didn't know all the local stories. He followed the tracks of an animal and got closer to the Greene property than anyone had in years. At that point, he started to hear noises coming from the house. These sounds weren't scary in the usual way. They were music, or something like music-a melody that sounded like several instruments playing together, but the notes didn't fit into any musical scale he knew. The music was oddly appealing, almost hypnotic, and he found himself walking toward the source without really thinking about it. His feet moved almost on their own, and each step brought him closer to the house on the hilltop. Finally, when he got to the gate, something inside him fought back. He stopped and blinked as if he had just woken up from a dream. He looked around, trying to figure out how he had gotten there. The music was still playing, but it was easier to hear now. It was definitely coming from inside the house. He could see a soft light moving through the windows, like candle flames dancing to the beat of that impossible song. He then saw that there were shadows moving inside, figures that looked like they were dancing or doing some kind of coordinated ritual. Finally, fear won out over the hypnotic pull. The hunter turned and ran, tripping over roots and branches. His heart was racing so fast that he could hear the blood pumping in his ears. The music followed him for a while, and it seemed to get louder even as he moved away, as if it were trying to catch up with him and pull him back. The music finally stopped when he crossed a certain stream that ran through the valley. It stopped suddenly as if an invisible door had been slammed shut. He told some people in the nearest village about what happened to him, and they told him the whole story about the Greene property. The hunter was clearly upset to find out how close he had come to getting into that house. After hearing that sexy music, he promised himself he would never go back to that area. He kept his word and hunted in completely different places, even if it meant longer trips. The hunter's incident brought up talks about the property that people had been avoiding for years. The topic came up again at church meetings and around campfires. Some people thought it might be time to do something more drastic, like burning the house down, or at least putting up signs all around the area to keep people from coming. But something always got in the way of these talks when they started to pick up speed. Someone got sick, a storm ruined crops, and other problems that needed to be fixed right away came up. It was as if the very idea of interfering with the property made people fight back, not in a big way, but through a series of small problems that always came up at the right time to get people to stop paying attention. People finally gave up. The Greene property would stay the same, a marked and avoided place, a quiet reminder that there were things in the world that were hard to understand and control. In the summer of 1918, a man who called himself a researcher of strange events came to the area. He had come from the East Coast, gathering stories about places and events that didn't make sense. He became very interested when he heard about the Greene property. He didn't see it as a problem like the locals did. He saw it as a chance to record something truly amazing. The villagers tried to talk him out of it. They told all the stories, all the warnings, and all the reasons why that place should be left alone. The researcher, on the other hand, was sure that he could finally figure out what was going on with that house if he used the right scientific method, the right tools, and took his time. He had notebooks for taking detailed notes, a camera to record the visual evidence, and an unshakable belief that everything had a logical reason that needed to be found. He spent days getting ready, reading the stories he could find, and making maps of the property based on what people who had been there told him. He made a detailed plan to spend several hours on the property during the day, when the sun could clear up any mystery. He planned everything down to the last detail, leaving nothing to chance. He was sure that his logical and methodical approach would work where fear and superstition had failed. The researcher left early on the day he chose to do his research, carrying all of his tools in a heavy backpack. He walked with purpose along the path that led to the property, taking notes on the plants he saw along the way, measuring distances, and keeping track of everything with the accuracy of someone who had been trained in the scientific method. He stopped to take a few pictures of the house from different angles when he could see it. The pictures showed the rundown building against the cloudy morning sky. He didn't think twice before stepping through the gate. His boots made a loud crunch as he walked down the overgrown path to the front door. He stopped for a moment to write down more notes about the outside of the building, the way the plants grew around it, and the strange shapes they made. He took a deep breath, moved his backpack to his back, and pushed open the door to get inside. The researcher spent the first few hours carefully recording every room in the house because he was determined to face whatever was waiting for him inside with the cold light of reason and methodical investigation. He took pictures of the symbols on the walls, measured them, and copied them into his notebooks with great care. He wrote down the temperature and humidity in each room, as well as any other information that could be measured or stored. He used a systematic method, treating the property like any other scientific object of study. He was determined to get concrete data and proof of anything unusual that was happening there. But as the day went on, he started to see some things that didn't fit with the explanations he had planned. The temperature in the house changed a lot from room to room for no clear reason. In some places, the air was hot and stuffy, while in others it was as cold as it was in the middle of winter. In some places, his measuring tools worked fine, but in others, they just stopped working or gave readings that didn't make sense, which he thought were just technical problems. There was also the issue of the sounds. He heard them all the time, footsteps coming from different floors, doors opening and closing when he was the only one home. He first thought that the old building settling and the wood expanding and contracting with temperature changes were to blame. But the sounds happened too often and were too strange for this explanation to be good enough. It looked like they were following a pattern, like someone was purposely walking from one place to another in a set way. The researcher found something that made him stop when he got to the room that had been locked from the inside years before. He was sure that the diary on the table wasn't there when he walked through that hallway earlier. He walked up to it carefully and looked at it without touching it at first. The diary was open to a certain page, and the handwriting was clear and easy to read. The ink was still a little wet, so it was probably written recently. The words on the page made me feel uneasy. They told how he got to the property that morning, what he did while he was there, and how he measured things. It felt like someone was watching him and writing down what he did as it happened. But he was sure he was the only one in the house. He had looked in every room. No one else was there. Unless there were hidden rooms and secret passages that he hadn't found yet. He should have been more worried about this than he was. A part of him still held on to the idea that there might be a logical reason. Maybe the locals were playing a trick on him to see how curious he was. But a deeper, more primal part of his mind knew that something very strange was going on, something that his theories and tools weren't ready to measure or explain. He chose to go to the basement, which all the reports said was the center of the problems. They would be there if there were answers to be found. He turned on his brightest flashlight and carefully went down the stairs, which creaked under his weight with every step. The air in the basement was different. It was thicker and had a dampness that seemed to stick to his skin, and there was that faint smell that he couldn't quite place, a mix of old dirt and something sweet that didn't belong there. Unlike what he had heard before, this time the door to the deepest room was locked. He put his hand on the doorknob and felt something strange. The wood was warm, almost feverish, and it pulsed a little, like it had its own heartbeat. He instinctively pulled back, wiped his palm on his pants, and looked at the door with new fear. It couldn't be explained by the weather or the building falling apart. He took a deep breath and turned the doorknob to open the door. It opened easily, without the creaking sound that rusty hinges make. The room that had been described in so many stories was on the other side, but it looked different now. The greenish light that came from the symbols on the walls was stronger than the description said it would be. The circle on the floor looked like it had just been drawn, and the candles around it were lit. The flames danced gently even though there was no draft. The researcher couldn't move at the door. Before that impossible scene, all of his beliefs about how science works and how to explain things rationally started to fall apart. There was no one there to light those candles. He was sure he was the only one in the house. And yet there they were, peacefully burning, as if they were waiting for him. He wanted to leave that room and the whole house, but his feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. He then realized that he wasn't the only one. He couldn't see anyone in person, but he felt like someone was watching him. It was like being in an amphitheater full of invisible people who were all watching him and waiting to see what he would do. He tried to move and step back, but his body didn't fully obey his commands. It was like he was swimming through thick water, and every move he made took a lot of work. The flames on the candles grew bigger, and the light got brighter until the whole room was filled with that strange greenish light. He then saw, or rather he sensed, there were shapes in the light, patterns that moved and changed, suggesting geometries that his mind couldn't fully understand. They were like shadows turned inside out, darkness that was inside the light itself. They looked like they were coming closer to him, curious and interested. Finally, the researcher was able to move. He turned quickly and left the room. He tripped on the stairs in the basement and dropped all of his gear. The only thing on his mind was getting out of that house as soon as possible. When he finally made it through the main door and into the light, he fell to his knees, gasping for air, and his body shook uncontrollably. In those moments in the basement, everything he thought he knew about reality was put into question. He left the property without looking back, leaving behind all of his expensive gear, his notebooks full of notes, and his camera with pictures that would never be developed. He was in a state of deep shock when he got to the nearest village. The people who found him brought him inside, gave him food and water, and tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't stop talking about things that shouldn't exist, and how fragile rational explanations are in the face of certain realities. He left the area a few days later, and he was still clearly shaken. Before he left, he told anyone who would listen that the Greene property was not a good place for scientific research or intellectual curiosity. There was something there that worked in ways that modern science couldn't understand or explain. He begged everyone not to try to fight whatever lived there in his last words. Years went by, and the Greene property still looked like an open wound in the Appalachian Mountains. The house stayed standing, fighting time and the weather in ways that normal buildings couldn't. Storms that knocked down trees that had been around for hundreds of years and destroyed strong barns seemed to miss that hill, or when they did hit the property, they didn't do much damage. It was as if something was actively protecting that place, keeping it safe for reasons that no one wanted to question too much. The area changed in the 1920s. People built better roads that connected small towns to bigger cities. Modernity started to reach those remote mountains. Some areas got electricity, and cars replaced horse-drawn carriages. But the Greene estate stayed the same. a place of mystery in the midst of progress. The new roads were built on purpose to avoid that hill. Drivers were told to take different routes that added time to their trips, but kept everyone safe. During this time, new kinds of accounts about the property started to show up. People who drove by the house at night said they saw lights moving past the windows. These lights weren't just the steady glow of lamps or candles. They were complex patterns of light that seemed to dance and pulse in almost mathematical sequences. Some people said they saw shadows in the windows, figures watching the road, but when they looked directly at them, they seemed to disappear or change into shapes that were hard to remember. There were also reports of sounds that got more common over time. Night travelers described hearing voices coming from the direction of the property, not screams or sounds of suffering, but conversations in multiple languages. Some sounded like old dialects of English or European languages, while others were completely new to human ears. It sounded like these voices were having long, complicated conversations and arguments about things that listeners couldn't fully understand. It was as if they were picking up bits of conversations that were happening in dimensions that were just a little bit off from normal reality. People who had to spend a lot of time near the property because they needed to or made a mistake while navigating started to report a very disturbing event. They said that the place was becoming more and more familiar to them, as if they had been there before, even though they were sure it was their first time in the area. False memories started to creep into their minds. They remembered walking through those rooms, taking part in ceremonies in that basement room, and saying things in languages they didn't know. These implanted memories made people very confused, and many of them had nightmares that came back over and over again in the months that followed. In 1925, a family moved into a house next door, which was only a few kilometers away from the Greene land and surrounded by thick forest. They were new to the area and came because the land was cheap and they thought they could live peacefully in the mountains. They didn't get a good warning about the property next door, and they didn't find out about it until they had already moved in. At first, they didn't pay much attention to the stories they started to hear. They were practical people who were used to hard work and didn't believe in local superstitions. But the family soon started to notice strange things. Their animals acted strangely, often staring at the Greene property for hours at a time, as if they were watching something that people couldn't see. The cows wouldn't eat in some parts of their land, especially the ones closest to the Greene's property. On some nights, the dogs barked nonstop, always in the same direction. Their voices were full of fear that even the least sensitive members of the family could feel. The head of the family, a strong man who wasn't easily scared, chose to look into it himself. On a clear fall afternoon, he walked through the woods to the Greene property, determined to see for himself what was causing all the fuss. He brought his shotgun with him, not because he thought he would need it, but because it was smart to be armed when going into new mountain areas. As he got closer, he noticed that the silence grew deeper, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. He stopped when he finally saw the house through the trees. There was something very wrong with that building, something that went beyond how broken down it looked. It took up space in a way that made it seem both solid and somehow see-through, as if it were in more than one layer of reality at the same time. He blinked a few times to clear his vision, but the feeling didn't go away. The house seemed to pulse very slowly, getting bigger and smaller in a way that didn't match anything in nature. He didn't get any closer. He felt something deep down, something that went beyond logical thought, that crossing that invisible line would be a mistake he couldn't take back. He slowly backed away, keeping his eyes on the house until the trees hid it from view again. He let his body relax only when he was well inside his own property. At that point, he realized that he had been tense and that his muscles were hurting. That night, he called his family together and told them that no one should ever go near the property next door. He didn't go into detail about what he had seen or felt, only making it clear that this was a rule that couldn't be broken. His wife didn't question it because she could see how serious he was and how his hands were still shaking a little bit as he held the coffee cup. The stories she had heard from other people in the area suddenly seemed more believable. The family made a careful plan for the next few months that completely avoided that direction. They set up their daily tasks on parts of their land that were as far away from the border with Greene as possible. Still, they kept seeing strange things that they couldn't explain. There were nights when everyone woke up at the same time, around 3 o'clock in the morning, and felt like something had called their names. Things in their house would sometimes go missing and then show up in strange places, as if invisible hands had moved them. The wife started having dreams about the house next door that happened over and over. In these dreams, she walked through the hallways of the Greene property, but the rooms never ended. They went on and on, beyond what the building could hold. There were doors that led to places that weren't possible, staircases that went up and down at the same time, and windows that showed landscapes that weren't in West Virginia or anywhere else she knew. These dreams were so real that she would wake up tired, as if she had really spent hours walking through those impossible places. The oldest son of the family, a strong and brave young man in his 20s, started to feel a strange pull toward the Greene property. While he was working, he kept looking in that direction, and he felt more and more like he had to go there and see what everyone else was so scared of. Every day he fought against this urge, but it got stronger over time, as if something were trying to pull him in on purpose, putting thoughts in his head that seemed like they were his own, but that he knew on some level weren't completely his own. One night, he woke up to find himself outside in his pajamas, walking toward the woods that separated his property from the Greenes. He didn't remember getting out of bed or going downstairs. It was as if he had woken up in the middle of an action and his body was doing it without his conscious consent. He immediately pulled back because he was so shocked by what he found, but the experience left him very upset. He told his parents about the sleepwalking incident, and they all talked about how they might have to leave the house and move somewhere else. But they had invested everything they had in that land, and leaving would mean losing everything. They were stuck between needing money and a growing fear that neither of them could fully explain. As a compromise, they decided to install external locks on the doors at night, making it impossible for anyone to leave the house while sleeping without waking the other family members. This worked for a while, but the Greene property still had an effect on other things. On some nights, the very air around their house seemed to change. The air got thicker, and the static electricity made the hair on their arms stand on end. Strange sounds echoed through the forest, not of wild animals, but something that seemed like structured language in frequencies that human ears were not designed to fully process. They were like words being spoken through dimensional filters, arriving distorted but still carrying fragments of meaning that touched primitive parts of the brain. The family eventually developed a sort of unspoken truce with whatever inhabited the neighboring property. They kept their distance, didn't talk about the place more than necessary, and tried to live their lives as normally as possible. In return, the manifestations seemed to lessen in intensity, becoming rarer, though never disappearing completely. They seemed to have found a fragile balance, an unspoken agreement that they would live together without bothering each other. As the decades passed, the Greene estate became part of the regional folklore of the Appalachian Mountains. Stories were passed down from generation to generation, each adding its own layers of interpretation and meaning. For some, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of unbridled curiosity, about tampering with forces beyond human comprehension. For others, it represented something deeper, a fissure in consensual reality, a place where the normal rules of existence simply didn't apply in the same way. During the 1930s, writers and folklorists occasionally arrived in the region, drawn by stories circulating about haunted places and unexplained phenomena in the mountains. When they inquired about the Greene property, they encountered a universal reluctance to discuss the matter in detail. People offered sanitized versions of the stories, omitting the most disturbing details, actively discouraging any attempt to visit the site. There was an unwritten protocol of protection surrounding the place, a silent conspiracy of silence that kept curious outsiders at bay. Those few who ignored the warnings and attempted to locate the property frequently reported strange experiences. Maps that worked perfectly in other areas of the mountains seemed to become confusing when used to navigate toward the Greenland. Trails that should have led to the hill somehow ended up in completely different places. It was as if geography itself conspired to keep people away, bending routes and distorting directions in ways that defied conventional cartography. There were cases of people who managed to reach the property but couldn't remember the return journey. They would wake up in their inns or tents with no clear memory of how they had returned, only disconnected fragments of disturbing images, conversations in ancient languages, corridors that stretched endlessly, symbols that burned behind their eyelids even when their eyes were closed. These people usually left the region hastily, carrying with them an unease that would persist for the rest of their lives. In 1937, there was an attempt to officially document the property for land registration purposes. A surveyor was sent to precisely map the boundaries of the Greene land and assess the condition of the structures. He was an experienced professional, accustomed to working in difficult terrain and challenging conditions. He didn't care about the stories from the area. He thought they were just rural superstitions that came from people's imaginations and a lack of formal education. One spring morning, the surveyor showed up at the property with his measuring tools and mapping tools. He started his work in a methodical way, setting up reference points, doing calculations, and writing down his observations in his official notebook. In the first few hours, everything seemed to be going as planned. The house was there, and it was clear that it was falling apart, but it was still standing. He drew it with professional accuracy. But as the day went on, he started to see that his measurements were off. The numbers didn't add up right. When we measured the inside of the house, it seemed much bigger than the outside dimensions would allow. He did the math again and again and checked his tools, but the results that didn't make sense kept coming up. It was like the space inside that building had its own geometry, bending back on itself in ways that Euclidean math couldn't fully explain. He chose to go inside the house and take measurements himself in the hopes of fixing the problems. He knew right away that it was a mistake as soon as he stepped inside. The inside of the house was way too big for what it should have been. The corridors went in ways that didn't match the floor plan on the outside. He could see staircases from the outside, but they led to floors that weren't really there in the building. Doors that, when opened, showed rooms that looked like they went beyond the walls of the building. The surveyor tried to stay calm and professional, but he could feel panic starting to set in. He quickly left the house, his hands shaking as he put away his tools. He didn't finish the job or try to take any more measurements. He just picked up his things and left, hurrying back to the nearest village along the path. When he turned in his report to the authorities, he just said that the property couldn't be properly mapped using the usual methods and suggested that it not be included in the official records. This choice made for an interesting bureaucratic oddity. The Greene property was in a kind of legal limbo because it was on older maps but not on newer records. That piece of land didn't have an owner, a classification, or any administrative use. This legal gray area ended up keeping people away because there were no clear property records to support claims or development in the area. The Greene estate stayed in its strange isolation during the 1940s, when the world was at war. Some people in the area who had been in the war and come back had different ideas about fear and trauma. They had seen terrible things made by people, like violence on a large scale. Still, many people said that being near the Greene estate felt different, somehow deeper. It was a fear that didn't come from real threats, but from something that went deeper into the mind, an existential unease that made them question what reality really was. People started to spread new ideas about what really happened on that land. Some people thought that the Greene brothers had found a natural portal, a thin barrier between dimensions that the rituals in the old diary had broken. Some people thought the place had always been special, and that ancient people who lived in those mountains long before Europeans came knew about it and stayed away from it. There were stories from native tribes about that hill that said it was a place where the line between worlds was very thin. An elder from a nearby indigenous community finally agreed to talk about the issue and talked about oral traditions that mentioned that area. These old stories say that there were sacred but dangerous places in the mountains where spirits roamed freely and where people shouldn't stay after dark. The hill where the Greene property was built was one of those places. For generations, it has been seen as land owned by forces that came before people. This point of view added a new level of understanding. Maybe the Greene brothers didn't make the problem happen. They just woke something up that was already there, something that was dormant or existed in a latent state until the rituals in the diary provided the right spark. The buried box might have been an attempt to seal that place and keep the forces inside. By opening it, William had accidentally taken away the only protection that kept the full manifestations from happening. The Greene estate was still a mystery in the Appalachian Mountains, no matter what the truth was. It was a constant reminder that even though science and technology have come a long way, there are still mysteries in the world that can't be explained by normal means. There are places where established rules don't work, where reality seems more flexible and responsive to consciousness and intentions in ways that go against the strict materialism of the modern age. The Greene estate is still there today, somewhere deep in the Appalachian Mountains. A house that doesn't change, always waiting, as if it has secrets that should never have been found. The stories are still being told, and each generation adds its own fears, warnings, and interpretations. This story has a very human quality, don't you think? The desire to learn that makes us go after it even when our instincts tell us to back off. William Greene embodies this impulse in its most unadulterated and perilous manifestation. He saw something that promised answers and understanding that went beyond what he could normally understand, and he couldn't help himself. And Thomas, his brother, is the voice of caution that we all have inside us. It's the part of us that knows when we're getting close to places we shouldn't go. What makes this story so interesting is how it makes us question what we think we know about reality. We think that the world works according to rules that are set in stone and easy to understand. But what if these rules don't always hold true? Places where matter and consciousness interact in ways that science can't yet measure or explain. The Greene estate wants us to think about these options, even though they might make us uncomfortable. Thomas got away, but he would always remember what happened to him. He watched as his brother changed into something else, something that looked like a person but thought in strange ways. And that vision, that knowledge that such changes were possible, must have haunted him every waking moment. It costs something to see the impossible happen, like when the foundations of reality break right in front of your eyes. People say that the house is still there. On the darkest nights, its windows still sometimes shine with that greenish light. The symbols on the walls are still there, and they pulse with meanings that human minds were not made to fully understand. And in the basement, in the room that is the deepest, the circle waits. The candles never go out, and something watches from behind folded dimensions, waiting and watching. The thought that William Greene is still there in some way, neither dead nor alive in the way we understand it, but existing in some middle state, Acting as a bridge between realities might be the most disturbing thing. The rituals he did may have changed him into something that was needed to keep those beings connected to this world. He might have become part of the very structure of that place, with his broken mind spread out across the impossible rooms that go beyond Euclidean geometry. And the diary, that old book that started it all, is still a mystery. Who wrote it? How did you learn that? And how many other boxes like that one are buried in far-off places all over the world, waiting for someone to find them and open them? These are questions that haven't been answered yet, and they leave holes in the story that our minds fill with more and more disturbing ideas. The Greene estate shows us something important about limits. There are lines that shouldn't be crossed, and it's not just because they're not allowed. It's because what lies on the other side may not be good for human health. There are some things we can't really pay for without losing something important about ourselves, and there are good reasons, beyond superstition, to stay away from certain places. As we end this dark chapter in the Appalachian Mountains, we feel uneasy. The story ends, but we know that the property is still out there, unchanged and waiting. And maybe that's the scariest thing of all, not a big ending or a cathartic resolution, but the knowledge that some things will always be there, waiting.